Part 1. Why the Great Wall of China didn't stop invaders. Hey guys, tonight we're starting with something big. Literally, very big. So big you can supposedly see it from space, though, spoiler alert, that's mostly a myth. Yes, we're talking about the Great Wall of China. So, dim your lights, fluff your pillows, and prepare to get cozy, because tonight's story is less about heroic defenses and more about, well, disappointment. Because as impressive as the Great Wall looks on postcards, the harsh truth is this: it didn't actually do a great job of keeping invaders out, which, if you think about it, is kind of the one thing a giant wall is supposed to be good at. Now, don't get me wrong, the wall is undeniably one of the world's most ambitious engineering projects. It snakes across mountains, deserts, and grasslands for thousands of miles. Dynasties poured staggering amounts of resources, labor, and unfortunately human lives into its construction. And yet, spoiler number 2, Mongols, Manchus, and assorted nomadic groups just sort of walked around it, or bribed the guards, or opened the gates from the inside, because history is nothing if not an endless cycle of anticlimaxes. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's back up. Let's float slowly into the dim and dusty beginnings of this giant, not-so-effective wall. The idea of building barriers to keep people out wasn't exactly original. Humans have been stacking rocks into walls since they first realized that rocks are heavy and annoying to climb over. Ancient city-states had walls, castles had walls, even gardens had little fences to keep goats from demolishing the vegetables. So when Chinese rulers faced threats from nomadic groups in the north, the idea of building walls was not revolutionary. What was revolutionary, or maybe just excessive, was doing it on such a ridiculous scale. The earliest stretches of what we call the Great Wall were thrown up in the 7th century BCE, long before it was great or even a wall in the way we picture it today. These were more like regional defenses, piles of earth and tamped-down dirt ridges. Think less iconic battlements and more very long, very boring dirt mound. But hey, it's the thought that counts. By the time of the Warring States period, around the 5th to 3rd centuries BCE, these little mounds multiplied. Each kingdom built its own many-wall to keep enemies, or at least their horses, at bay. Which is funny when you think about it, because they were all technically Chinese states fighting each other, building walls against their neighbors who they'd probably be allied with in about 5 minutes. Very efficient use of manpower, as always. Then along came Qin Shi Huang, the famous first emperor of China, who really liked big projects. He was the guy who thought it was a good idea to have life-size terracotta armies buried underground. He was also the guy who thought, you know what this fragmented collection of walls needs? A makeover. And by makeover, I mean force hundreds of thousands of peasants, soldiers, and convicts to link them together into one long mega-wall. Because why not double down on questionable projects when you're already emperor? So under Qin Shi Huang in the 3rd century BCE, the Great Wall started to look a little more, well, great. Not great in the sense of militarily effective, but great in the sense of absurdly long and exhausting to build. The labor conditions were, unsurprisingly, terrible. People died by the thousands. Later legends even claimed that workers' bodies were buried inside the wall itself, though that's probably an exaggeration. Still, it tells you how traumatic the experience was that people believed the wall literally had corpses holding it together. Not exactly the cheery tourist brochure you see today. But here's the kicker. Even after all that, the wall didn't exactly work. Nomadic groups from the north, especially the Xiongnu, who were kind of the terrifying horse lords of the steppe before the Mongols, just found ways around it. Because here's the problem with building a giant linear wall. Unless you have infinite manpower and infinite money, you can't guard every inch of it. All the Xiongnu had to do was wait for the guards to get lazy, find a weak point, or, go around the end. It's the same basic flaw as putting a flimsy lock on a massive sliding door. Impressive to look at, but not hard to get past if you're determined. And that became the pattern, over and over again for the next 1,500 years. Dynasties would rise, decide the wall needed repairs or extensions, force thousands of people into brutal labor, and then invaders would still come through anyway. Wash, rinse, repeat. Let's fast forward a bit to the Ming Dynasty, because this is the era that gave us the classic Great Wall, the one people recognize today, with stone blocks, watchtowers, and all the Instagram-worthy battlements. The Ming rulers of the 14th to 17th centuries had good reason to be paranoid. The Mongols had taken over China under the Yuan dynasty, and the Ming were determined not to let that happen again. So they poured huge resources into fortifying the northern frontier. Out went the old dirt mounds, in came massive stone fortifications. These walls marched across the mountains like a stubborn declaration. Not this time, nomads, not this time. Except, yes, this time too, and the next time, and the time after that. You see, while the Ming were building their wall, the Mongols were adapting. They didn't necessarily need to storm the wall head-on. They could raid smaller villages, test weak points, or just bribe local officials. And bribery was incredibly effective. If you're a poorly paid garrison soldier stationed on a freezing mountain pass and a group of Mongols shows up offering silver in exchange for looking the other way, well, suddenly that impenetrable wall has a very convenient door. But the most famous example of the wall failing its one job came in the 17th century when the Manchus, future founders of the Qing dynasty, invaded. How did they get past the wall? Did they tunnel under it? Did they scale it with ladders? Did they invent some kind of early cannon-powered rocket system? No, they basically just walked through the gates. One Ming general, Wu Songui, famously opened a key section of the wall at Shanhaiguan, letting the Manchus march right in. Why? Because he was caught between fighting rebel forces on one side and the Manchus on the other, and he decided the rebels were the bigger problem. So he cut a deal, which means that after centuries of wall building, stone hauling, and human suffering, the Great Wall's fate came down to one guy saying, let's just open it. So why didn't the Great Wall work? Well, the short answer is that walls are only as good as the people defending them, and China's northern frontier was enormous. It stretched across mountains, deserts, and grasslands, covering thousands of miles. Even with thousands of guards, there were always gaps, always weak points, always opportunities for invaders. It's kind of like locking the front door of your house but leaving all the windows open. Technically, yes, you made the effort, but if someone really wants to get in, they'll get in, especially if they can just bribe your roommate to let them through. And here's the ironic part. Despite its questionable military success, the Great Wall became one of the most enduring symbols of China. It was a psychological statement as much as a physical barrier. It told the world, we are powerful enough to build this, we are organized enough to maintain this, and we are serious enough to at least try. In practice, it may have failed to stop nomads, but symbolically, it represented stability, authority, and the might of the emperor. So, tonight, as you settle into your blankets and drift toward sleep, remember this: the Great Wall of China might not have been the ultimate defense system its builders hoped for, but it stands as a monument to human stubbornness, ambition, And maybe a little bit of wishful thinking, because sometimes building a massive wall isn't about keeping people out, it's about convincing yourself that you can. And with that, let's slowly glide into the next part of our story, because while the wall itself may have failed, the dynasties behind it were endlessly fascinating, and many of them were, frankly, a total mess, which makes for excellent bedtime history. Part 2. Walls, Dynasties, and the Endless Parade of Problems. So, you're all tucked in. Lights dim, maybe the rain outside is doing that nice tapping thing against the window. Perfect. Let's wander back to the wall. Or, more accurately, the people who kept insisting the wall was a brilliant idea, even when it very clearly wasn't. Because the Great Wall wasn't just a wall, it was a dynasty-to-dynasty project, a recurring obsession. Like that one friend who won't stop trying new diets every few months, convinced that this one will definitely work this time. Let's start with the Han Dynasty, because they were the ones who took Qin Shi Huang's dream wall and actually tried to maintain it. Qin had set the foundation and then promptly died, possibly from mercury poisoning, because of course he did. Apparently, drinking elixirs of immortality isn't the best health plan. The Han emperors who took over in 206 BCE looked at his very expensive, mostly crumbling dirt fortifications and thought, yeah, let's keep that going, because maintaining an absurdly long dirt wall across barren wastelands seemed like a good use of manpower. And they weren't just building walls, they were also trying to establish garrisons, set up watchtowers, and create little outposts to station soldiers. Which sounds very organized until you realize most of these soldiers were deeply miserable about being there. Imagine being posted to the middle of nowhere with freezing winds, nothing to do, and occasional terrifying raids from horse archers. Oh, and your pay was often late, because the imperial treasury was usually broke from, guess what, wall maintenance. So, morale was not exactly stellar. Records from the Han era describe soldiers sneaking away, abandoning posts, or sometimes just dying in droves from the harsh conditions. The wall might have looked imposing, but behind those battlements were some very grumpy, very underpaid guards who would happily accept bribes in exchange for a quiet life. Now, one interesting thing about the Han Dynasty is that they actually experimented with alternatives to walls. At one point, they tried a more diplomatic strategy with the Xiongnu, the steppe confederation that kept raiding them. And by diplomatic, I mean they sent princesses to marry nomadic chieftains in exchange for peace, which, to be fair, worked about as well as the wall did, meaning not very. Because the Xiongnu still raided anyway. Apparently, here, take a royal bride was not the ultimate solution. Who knew? So, once again, the empire poured energy back into wall maintenance, and the cycle continued. Spend a fortune on walls, watch them crumble, watch enemies stroll past anyway, rinse and repeat. Fast forward a few centuries to the Sui and Tang dynasties. These guys had their own wall-building phases, though they weren't quite as obsessed. The Sui, in particular, were a bit distracted by their other famously disastrous infrastructure project, the Grand Canal, which was magnificent but also bankrupting. The Tang dynasty, meanwhile, was one of China's golden ages, full of poetry, art, and trade. They weren't as interested in wall building, partly because they thought diplomacy and military campaigns were more useful. Communication was efficient. Light a fire on one watchtower and the signal could travel for hundreds of miles in a single night. A medieval text message system, basically. But of course, there were problems. First, maintaining a wall that long required staggering resources. Entire provinces were drained of supplies just to keep the wall staffed. And second, the garrisons were, once again, miserable. Picture it, freezing winters in the Gobi Desert, little food, no proper shelter, and endless boredom. It's not exactly a dream posting. So, unsurprisingly, soldiers often deserted, or drank, or gambled, or, as mentioned earlier, took bribes. If a Mongol envoy showed up with a few bags of silver, suddenly the impenetrable wall developed a very convenient doorway. Which brings us to one of the most ironic episodes in Chinese history, the fall of the Ming dynasty to the Manchus. The Manchus weren't the Mongols. They were a semi-nomadic people from Northeast Asia who had been building up power while the Ming were struggling with internal rebellions. The Ming Empire was already wobbling badly. Corruption, famines, peasant uprisings. The wall was still there, looking dramatic and expensive, but the dynasty behind it was cracking. And when the Manchus showed up at the wall, the outcome wasn't a massive siege, it wasn't a glorious Mongol-style charge, it was, well, paperwork. A Ming general named Wu Sangui, trapped between rebel forces on one side and the Manchus on the other, decided he'd rather throw his lot with the invaders. So he literally opened the gates of the Great Wall at Chanhaiguan and let the Manchus through. That was it. Centuries of labor, millions of bricks, endless lives lost in construction. And in the end, the wall was undone by one guy saying, "Fine, let him in." Now let's pause here and admire the almost comical futility of it all. The Great Wall was meant to be a symbol of impenetrability, but in practice it was a symbol of the very thing it was trying to stop, instability. You see, the real issue wasn't the nomads, it wasn't the wall itself, it was the dynasty's chronic inability to hold things together internally. A well-fed, well-organized empire could defend itself with or without a giant wall. A starving, corrupt empire, on the other hand, couldn't even defend itself with the longest wall in human history. So the wall wasn't really a defense mechanism, it was more like a psychological comfort blanket, a way for emperors to say, "Look, we're doing something, don't worry, we've got this." Except they didn't. And yet, here's the funny part, it still became iconic. Over time, the wall turned into one of China's most enduring symbols. Foreign visitors were impressed. Later generations romanticized it. Modern tourism turned it into a bucket list destination. Even though it failed militarily, the wall succeeded in becoming a monument to ambition, resilience, and stubbornness. And maybe that's the real story here. It wasn't about keeping invaders out, it was about convincing people that China was strong enough to build something so massive in the first place. So as we drift further into the story tonight, think of the Great Wall not as a triumph of military engineering, but as a kind of architectural diary. Every dynasty left its mark. Every emperor tried to prove something, and every failure was, ironically, cemented right into those bricks. In Part 3, we'll float gently into the personal side of these dynasties, the emperors who obsessed over walls while ignoring everything else, the court intrigues, and of course, the occasional royal meltdown. Because if the wall itself wasn't always interesting, the people behind it were endlessly, tragically, and sometimes hilariously flawed. Alright, so we've talked about the wall itself, and we've covered how it kept failing in the most embarrassing ways possible. Now it's time to meet the people who actually thought this was a good idea. Because behind every absurdly ambitious project is an emperor with an ego problem. And Chinese emperors had plenty of those. Let's float forward now to the Ming Dynasty, because this is where the wall really takes center stage. And the emperors of the Ming are, frankly, a parade of dysfunction. Take the Yongle Emperor. He seized the throne in a coup against his nephew, always a healthy way to start your reign, and then poured his energy into projects like moving the capital to Beijing, building the Forbidden City, and launching massive overseas expeditions with Zhang He's treasure fleets. He also kicked off major rebuilding on the Great Wall, because why not pile on another expensive project? His successors carried on the obsession. Some emperors wanted to strengthen the wall against Mongol raids, others just wanted the prestige of fixing the wall again. It was a sort of dynastic status symbol, proof you were a serious ruler. Forget feeding the peasants or fixing corruption, just slap another layer of bricks on the wall and call it progress. And oh, the Ming emperors, where do we even begin? The Zhengde emperor was one of my favorites, if only because he was so spectacularly unqualified. He basically treated the empire like a personal playground. He built fake marketplaces in the palace so he could play shopkeeper. He staged mock military campaigns where he got to dress up and ride around pretending to fight battles. He even kept a pet leopard, which roamed the palace like some kind of medieval Instagram flex. So when you imagine the Ming Dynasty struggling with external threats and desperately trying to maintain the wall, picture this guy running around in costumes, staging fake wars for fun. Priorities. Then there was the Jiajing Emperor, who reigned for 45 years and spent much of that time avoiding actual government work. He preferred alchemy, Taoist rituals, and allegedly drinking potions from the blood of young virgins to achieve immortality, again with the immortality theme. Someone should have told these guys about kale smoothies instead. Under his rule, wall construction was still ongoing, but the empire was a mess of corruption and neglect. So even as the wall looked more impressive, the actual state behind it was crumbling. One emperor who did take the wall seriously was the Wanli Emperor. His reign lasted nearly 50 years, but for most of it, he refused to actually show up at court. He basically went on strike, sulking in the palace while refusing to meet with officials. Imagine being the Emperor of China and just deciding you're not going to do your job anymore. That was Wanli. The wall did see significant strengthening during his time, but again, it didn't matter, because no amount of stone could compensate for an emperor who literally refused to govern. What ties all these emperors together is that their personal flaws bled directly into the wall project. Paranoia, laziness, vanity, obsession with immortality. All of these quirks shaped how and why the wall was built or neglected. And each time the result was the same, a massive, exhausting project that didn't solve the actual problem. Because the real threats to China were never just nomads on the steppe. They were internal: corruption, famine, peasant uprisings, officials more interested in bribes than service, soldiers more interested in survival than honor. The wall was a distraction, a very big, very visible distraction, and emperors loved distractions, especially when their own dynasties were rotting from within. And yet, we can't help but admire the sheer audacity. These emperors, many of whom could barely keep their palaces in order, still managed to command the construction of one of the largest structures in human history. That's the irony of the Great Wall. It was both a monument to failure and to greatness at the same time. When we look at it today, we don't see the desertions, the bribes, the collapsed treasuries. We see the winding stone ridges over mountains, the battlements stretching into the horizon. We see the ambition. And maybe, just maybe, that's what the emperors really wanted all along. So as you drift deeper into the story tonight, imagine these emperors. Qin Shi Huang popping mercury pills while ordering peasants to build his dirt walls. Emperor Wu wasting taxes on wizards. Ming rulers alternately building, neglecting, and then rebuilding the wall while playing dress-up or sipping immortality potions. It's messy. It's tragic. It's a little ridiculous. And it's the perfect kind of history to fall asleep to, because the details blur into a long parade of emperors making the same mistakes over and over again. In Part 4, we'll float toward the soldiers and common people, the laborers who actually lived and died on the wall. Their lives were not nearly as glamorous or as delusional as the emperors, and their stories might be the most quietly heartbreaking of all. Part 4. Life and Death on the Wall. All right, so far we've been hanging out with emperors, paranoid, egotistical, occasionally mercury-poisoned men who saw the Great Wall as their favorite, oversized vanity project. And of course, they weren't the ones actually stacking bricks or freezing on mountain ridges. That honor went to the ordinary people, the soldiers, the peasants, the convicts, and sometimes the very unlucky. And here's the thing, when you strip away the imperial grandeur, life on the wall was, well, absolutely miserable. The workers who built it. Let's start with the laborers. The Great Wall was not built by skilled masons, sipping tea and carefully setting stones. It was built by masses of forced laborers. Convicted criminals were sent to the wall as punishment. Peasants who couldn't pay taxes were conscripted. Soldiers who annoyed their commanders were dispatched as punishment. Basically, if you ticked off the wrong person in Imperial China, congratulations, you got a one-way trip to wall duty. Conditions were brutal. Workers often had to drag heavy stones up cliffs and mountains with little more than ropes, carts, and sheer desperation. There wasn't much in the way of safety standards. If you slipped, you died. If you collapsed, you were left behind. And if you starved, well, there was always someone else to take your place. Folklore is full of grim tales about this. The most famous is the legend of Meng Zhongnu, a woman whose husband was forced to work on the wall. When he died, she trekked all the way there to find him, wept bitterly at the sight, and, so the story goes, her tears brought down an entire section of stone. It's probably not historically accurate, but it captures the sense of hopelessness that surrounded the wall for those who built it. So yes, next time you admire those sweeping battlements, remember, they weren't made by choice. They were made by exhaustion, punishment, and more than a little misery. The soldiers who guarded it. Now, let's talk about the soldiers, because once the wall was up, it needed to be defended, which meant thousands of troops stationed in lonely outposts along thousands of miles of stone.
Life for them wasn't glamorous either. Forget the idea of proud warriors standing tall against the barbarian horde. Most of the time, soldiers were cold, hungry, and bored out of their minds. Supplies were a constant problem. Getting food and equipment out to remote stretches of wall was difficult. Soldiers often had to forage, beg, or extort peasants nearby just to survive. Pay was inconsistent, and corruption meant that whatever rations the government did send often disappeared into officials' pockets before reaching the wall. And morale? Pretty low. Imagine being stuck in a freezing watchtower, staring into the empty steppe, waiting for an enemy who might never come, or who might ride right past you anyway. Soldiers deserted frequently. Many simply slipped away, blending back into peasant life. Because really, who wouldn't? Daily life on the wall. So what did they actually do all day? Well, guard duty. Endless, monotonous guard duty. Looking out for smoke signals, which were used to communicate enemy movements across the wall's vast length. Each beacon tower could send signals to the next, creating a chain of reaction of warnings. Of course, this required soldiers to actually pay attention. And let's just say vigilance wasn't always their strong suit. Stories abound of soldiers missing enemy movements because they were drunk, asleep, or just didn't care. Some historians even argue that entire raids succeeded not because the wall was weak, but because the people manning it were just over it. When they weren't watching the horizon, soldiers did chores, cooking, repairing walls, tending to livestock if they had any. Occasionally skirmishes broke out with raiders, but mostly it was dull, cold endurance. And if you got sick or injured, too bad. There were no proper medical facilities on the wall. A fever could kill you. A broken bone could leave you useless, or worse, abandoned. The locals nearby. It wasn't just the soldiers and workers who suffered. Local peasants living near the wall often bore the brunt of its upkeep. They were taxed heavily to fund construction. They were forced to supply grain and materials. And sometimes they were even used as cannon fodder, dragged into military service when needed. For them, the wall wasn't some glorious symbol of Chinese civilization. It was just another burden, another demand from a state that seemed endlessly hungry for their labor. And ironically, the wall often hurt them more than it helped. Raiders who did make it through or around the wall frequently targeted border villages first. So instead of protection, peasants got to be the first victims. Not exactly a great trade-off. Did it ever actually work? Here's the million-dollar question. For all this suffering, did the wall actually do anything for the common people? The short answer is sort of, but not really. Yes, the wall slowed down some raids. Yes, it forced invaders to take longer routes or to bribe their way past instead of just riding in. In that sense, it offered some security, but it was never an impenetrable shield, too long, too porous, too dependent on soldiers who weren't exactly reliable. For the people building and living beside it, the wall was less about safety and more about imperial vanity. It existed because emperors wanted it to exist, not because it truly changed their daily lives. The human cost. It's hard to put numbers on how many people died building and guarding the wall, but estimates range in the hundreds of thousands, if not more. Generations of peasants saw their labor and lives drained away for a structure that in the end couldn't stop collapse after collapse of dynasties. Which honestly makes it all the more ironic. The wall is remembered today as one of the great wonders of the world, a monument to human endurance and determination. But for the people who actually touched it, hauled the stones, froze in the towers, buried their friends beside it, it was mostly just suffering. So as you drift off tonight, picture the silent watchtowers, the lonely soldiers warming their hands over small fires, the endless wind sweeping over empty ridges, the peasants staring up at a wall that demanded their sweat but gave them little in return. It's a reminder that history's grand monuments are often built on very unglamorous lives, and that sometimes the people at the bottom end up carrying the heaviest load for projects that don't even work. And with that, let's float toward the final stretch, because in part 5, we'll look at the legacy of the wall. Not just the stone still standing today, but how it became a symbol, reshaped, romanticized, and completely divorced from the messy, painful reality we've just explored. Part 5, the legacy of the wall. So here we are, drifting toward the end of this long stone snake's journey. We've talked about the emperors who obsessed over it, the workers who bled for it, the soldiers who froze on it, and the peasants who paid for it. Which leaves us with the big question: what did it all mean in the long run? Because let's be honest, the Great Wall didn't actually stop the invasions. The Mongols got through. The Manchus got through. Bandits, raiders, smugglers, they all got through. And yet today, the Great Wall stands in our imagination as this timeless wonder, a symbol of ancient China's strength and persistence. So how did something that was, in practice, a bit of a failure end up becoming one of the most famous monuments in the world? Let's glide into that. The Wall in decline. By the time the Ming Dynasty fell in the 1600s, the wall's usefulness was basically done. Gunpowder had changed warfare, cavalry raids were no longer the major threat, and maintaining thousands of miles of crumbling stone wasn't exactly cost-effective. Parts of the wall were abandoned. Towers fell into ruin. Farmers quietly dismantled chunks of it for building materials. For centuries, huge sections of the wall just sat there, collapsing back into hillsides, ignored and forgotten. And honestly, nobody really minded. For the average farmer in Qing Dynasty China, the Great Wall wasn't some proud heritage site. It was an old burden, a memory of taxes and labor demands, and an obstacle when you just wanted to move your goats across the hills. Rediscovery and romanticization. Fast forward to the 19th century, when European travelers started showing up in China. They saw the ruins of the wall and immediately declared it one of the greatest feats of human engineering. Never mind that most locals weren't impressed, it was exactly the kind of ancient mystery that fascinated Victorian explorers. Writers and map makers began to romanticize it. To them, the wall wasn't just a crumbling ruin, it was an epic symbol of an ancient civilization. Something exotic, mysterious, monumental. By the early 20th century, Chinese reformers and nationalists also began to reclaim it, not as a burden, but as a source of pride. The wall became a metaphor, a reminder that China had endured centuries of hardship, yet still stood. It stopped being about whether the wall worked and became about what it represented. The wall as propaganda. Let's also be clear, governments love symbols, and the Great Wall, once a forgotten ruin, was suddenly very useful. In the 20th century, especially after the founding of the People's Republic of China, the wall became a propaganda tool. School children were told it was proof of China's ingenuity and perseverance. Tourists were shown restored sections near Beijing, rebuilt to look authentically ancient, even though many parts were more concrete than stone. The wall turned into a stage set, polished up to tell a story about a proud, eternal nation. And it worked. Today, millions of visitors every year hike along the wall, take photos, and marvel at its scale. Few stop to think about the conscripts who died building it, or the dynasties it failed to protect. But that's the nature of monuments. They're as much about the story we tell now as the history that actually happened. Myth versus reality. So let's stack it up clearly. The myth, the Great Wall of China was a mighty barrier, an impregnable shield that kept out all invaders for centuries. It's the one thing you can see from space. It's the ultimate symbol of Chinese strength. The reality, it was a patchwork of walls, often neglected, frequently bypassed, and ultimately conquered. It drained resources, cost countless lives, and never truly fulfilled its intended purpose. Oh, and no, you can't see it from space with the naked eye. Astronauts have confirmed this multiple times. Sorry to ruin that fun fact. Yet, in the end, the myth wins, because humans love neat stories. We love the idea of a wall that stood against the wild steppe, even if history was messier. Human side of memory. What's maybe most interesting is how the wall has shifted in meaning. For the emperors, it was about control. For the peasants, it was about suffering. For modern China, it's about pride. And for the rest of the world, it's about wonder. Each generation has reshaped the wall in its imagination. And in that sense, the Great Wall is less about stone and more about memory. It's a reminder that history is never just what happened, it's what we decide to remember and how we decide to tell it. Closing thoughts. So as you settle deeper into your pillow tonight, picture the wall stretching out across the mountains. Picture the crumbling battlements, the lonely watchtowers, the weeds pushing through ancient stones. Imagine the footsteps of countless workers, soldiers, peasants, most forgotten, but all leaving a trace. The Great Wall didn't stop the invaders, but it endures as a story, and maybe that's what really matters. Because in the end, history isn't just about victories or failures. It's about the strange, stubborn things we build, the lives we spend on them, and the myths we carry forward long after the stones have started to fall. So sleep well, knowing that even the world's biggest wall couldn't keep the chaos out. But at least it left us something to wonder about. And that's the end of our sleepy dive into the Great Wall. Would you like me now to compile parts 1 through 5 into a single continuous full script, around 11K to 13K words, so you have one smooth, YouTube-ready monologue?